All right, friends, welcome everyone. Those of you who are online and those on Zoom, on Zoom and in person. I'm going to be kind of moderating from the online platform, and when it's time to take questions, I'll call on people to speak. But I'm going to now turn it over to our presenters, starting with Mark Edwards, who's going to tell us a little bit about what we're doing today, and just a big welcome and thank you, friends, for being here.
Hi, folks. Good morning. Welcome. We're here this morning to explore briefly how St. John's is moving forward to help realize beloved community. Our efforts have operated on multiple levels, nationally, at the diocesan level, and the parish level, and ultimately individually. Our presentation this morning will share how this movement is grounded in the Episcopal Church pillars and practices. We'll briefly show how our current and future actions fit together to strive and achieve racial healing, reconciliation, and justice. As we do this work together, we're looking at the long view. As the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. However, nothing bends toward justice without us bending it. To achieve this, we need sustained effort, organizing, intention, and ultimately faith. In a prayer for the human family, our own Book of Common Prayer also directs us to break down the barriers between us. O God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us, unite us in the bonds of trust, and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time, all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Next slide, please. Okay.
Bill, is it letting you guys share?
Right.
Okay.
There we go. So go to the third slide, please. Next one. Great. So what's beloved community? This is the Episcopal Church's long-term commitment to racial healing, reconciliation, and justice. It's organized around 4 principles: telling the truth about our churches and race, proclaiming the dream of beloved community, practicing the way of love in the pattern of Jesus, and repairing the breach in society and institutions. And, take a look at the second point, which is, a fabulous quote by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And it's the core of what we're really talking about today. This sets the stage for what you're going to hear in a few minutes. Next slide, please. So, what informs this is presiding Bishop Michael Curry thought and all of his hard work to basically push us to be like Jesus, to live by his tenets and principles. And as he said, by committing to evangelism, the work of reconciliation across the borders and boundaries that divide us. It's difficult work, and that's true. But we can do it. It's about listening and sharing. It's about God. So we're going to change our frame of reference now and talk, next slide, please, and turn the presentation over to the real star of the morning, and that's Cathy O'Donnell, who's going to work through some of the work that she's been doing with the Diocesan Reparations Task Force. She's been doing that for quite some time, and I'm sure she'll go through that in some detail. Then we're going to bring this back to work here at St. John's and conclude our presentation. So Cathy, all yours.
Thank you, Mark.
Sure.
Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, I've been a parishioner at St. John's for about 42 years. I started working in the archives in 2008 with the former archivist here, Dick Hewlett. And in 2011, when he retired, I became the archivist at the discretion of the vestry as a volunteer, and I've been doing it ever since. In 2012, while reading through some of the earliest files in the archives, I read writings by our 9th rector, the Reverend James Kirkpatrick. His writings were quite disturbing as they contained his thoughts, which I found very upsetting, on the hordes of Catholics, Jews, and colored that are swarming into our country. I later discovered that our first rector, the Reverend James Battle Averett, was the first commissioned chaplain in the Confederate Army, for which he was eternally proud. Some of you may remember at an adult forum I did with Jay Malin, where we discussed at some length the writings of both rectors, and Jay discussed the fact that our surrounding community was founded by a racist, and he had racial covenants put in place in Chevy Chase. His name was Senator Newlands, and he was a devout racist. The signers of the deed to the church were all enslavers before and during the Civil War. As I said, it's been quite a journey for me. In February 2021, I was asked to join the Episcopal Diocese of Washington's Reparations Task Force, and I now serve as the co-chair of the Congregation History Partners, aiding other parishes to discover their history along the lines of racial injustice. Presiding Bishop Curry had requested each diocese to examine its own history with regard to racial injustice. Around that time, a group of people from different parishes within the Diocese of Washington combined forces to look into the question of reparations after taking the Sacred Ground course. They went to Bishop Mary Ann Buddy and asked her blessing of the group. She quickly gave her approval and joined them. Meeting monthly, this group has commissioned research on the racial history of the Diocese of Washington and a separate study of reparations done by others throughout the United States. The task force is also developing a relationship with other organizations to get more perspective, into the Black community. The Congregational History Partners group was started and now consists of 22 parishes. They were asked the following questions. When was your congregation founded? What were the major struggles around racial injustice at the time? Why was your congregation founded? Where did the funds to found your church come from? These are all hard questions to look at. Sometimes it seems pretty simple, but it's not when you get into the where did the funds come from? Where did the land come from? Was it owned by former enslavers? Was it a gift to the church outright with any covenants applied to it? What about your surrounding community? Did it have a lot of covenants? Who were the people that made up the parish? It's hard to look at that. Meeting on a monthly basis, we have started the hard work of truth finding, truth listening, and truth telling. A book is planned in the near future with stories from each of these parishes. Each has their own interesting story to tell. On October 1st, the task force, let's see. Let's show the videotape now of a talk I gave, of comments I made at the symposium the Reparations Task Force gave on October 1st. The symposium was held at Calvary Episcopal
Bill.
Church, Northeast Washington.
Bill, make sure to click on share sound as well when you share the screen. It's on the bottom left when you're sharing screen.
Take the village.
Little technical difficulty here.
That after he left St. John's, he wrote a book in 1901 entitled Old Plantation, How We Lived in the Great House and Cabin Before the War, which, according to Wikipedia, was written as a response to Uncle Tom's Cabin. Much later in 2011, while reading some of the early letters written by the rector in 1919, the Reverend James Kirkpatrick, I became quite upset as his writings were very appalling. His words were full of hatred for many different groups, for instance, Catholics, especially the Pope, anyone of color, immigrants, etc. To say that I was shocked would be a gross understatement. I went to my rector, the Reverend Dr. Sariatique, and had a long talk asking for guidance, as I didn't feel I could continue working in the archives. He was very thoughtful and asked me to consider the time period in which it was written and reminded me that it was the feeling of the entire country at the time. He asked me to continue my work. So I continued learning firsthand about the history of St. John's by reading more of the files in the archives. In December 2018, I gave a very whitewashed history of the parish, which was well received. However, I kept digging into the founders of the parish and discovered that all of those who had signed the deed were enslavers. At about this time, fellow parishioner Jane Malin approached me with more information on enslavers, which he had found while doing research for a documentary he was doing about 3 lynchings in Montgomery County. We were both appalled at what we were finding. Jay's foundings were that there were covenants and other exclusionary methods in the surrounding area, which forbade Jews, Middle Easterners, and colored people from buying in the area of Chevy Chase, and that the neighborhood was founded by an unabashed racist, Senator Newlands. After some prayer, more reading, and gathering of information, I felt that the story of the racial intolerance in our early history needed to be told. In January 2020, with Sari's blessing, I shared what I had learned with the parish in a joint presentation with Jay. I had written articles in our newsletter to let people know what I would be talking about. Consequently, there seemed to be no surprise at what I told them, but there were lots of questions. The main question was, when did this attitude change, as it obviously has changed at St. John's? I have no definitive answer, just that over time, as in our country, attitudes have changed for the better, but there is lots of work still to be done. Others have thanked me for what I have found and for sharing this information. I have also given a presentation to Bethesda Historical Society, which had basically the same reaction. Discovering the truth of our founding was and still is a difficult matter to deal with. The fact that slavery was accepted as the norm is not okay. The money that established our church to be was tainted money. The worst part for me is that those feelings of hatred for a group of God's people were accepted as normal by the church at St. John's and in the Diocese of Maryland and then Washington. There have been a lot of changes at St. John's over the years. Our first African-American associate rector, the Reverend Janice Robinson, served from 1988 to 1995, and she was much loved. Others have followed as associate rector, senior warden, and members of the vestry. All are welcome now at St. John's as we continue to hope for changes in the hearts of all.
So at the symposium, it was attended by by a little over 80 people in person. And there were a number of people who joined on Zoom. It's unclear. I don't have a definite total, but they were all leaders of parishes throughout the diocese. At the symposium, we heard from the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, who is quite a powerful speaker on the subject of reparations. I would encourage you to go online and listen to her comments. They are well worth listening to. We also heard from Franklin Robinson Jr., who is writing the history of the Diocese of Washington. He concentrated on the earliest parishes in the diocese and on the use of enslaved people to build most of those churches. The first bishop in the colonies, and who was also the first bishop of Maryland, was Bishop Claggett. He was an enslaver. Tobacco was a currency used to pay for the clergy. The tobacco farms in the area all used enslaved people to harvest the crops. Maryland had the highest paid clergy in the colonies. Consequently, clergy wanted to come to Maryland and had their own slaves. We were asked to consider how to make amends and where does the community fit into this historical picture. And then we were asked a challenging question, which I would ask you all to think about. What would it mean and what would it require for the Diocese of Washington and its congregations to make reparations for the harm of racism? That's the open question now that we are dealing with. In January of 2023, the Reparations Task Force will be presenting a resolution to the diocesan convention on reparations, and we hope and expect it will pass. So that's all I have, Mark. I forget to talk all the time. I want to forget, right?
You can do it, yeah. Thanks, Cathy. Excellent, as usual. Could you go to the next slide, please? If anyone is interested in more information about the October 1 symposium, which both Cathy and I attended, it's really wonderful because it's available online. You can actually go into these links. You can listen to the entire presentation or take a look at the curriculum materials, articles, and I really encourage you to do that. It's tremendous information. And we can't summarize it here, but at your leisure, please take a look. Next. So let's again switch gears to what we're doing here at St. John's. We're no slouch when it comes to becoming beloved community. We do an awful lot across the board and have for many years. It's one of the astonishing things that my wife Catherine and I saw when we joined the church. The number of ministries and scope and span of work is really fantastic. It's kind of unbelievable. So, we've done many things with folks, here in Montgomery County, really others who are coming, and even people who are entering our shores from overseas. It's really something. Next. One of the things that folks may know or may not know is that our vestry met for its annual retreat in May 2021. And at that time, we heard presentations on race, church, and healing by a couple of folks who were representatives of two companies. One was called CCW Transformation, and the second 1619 Consulting. And the discussion that we had for a number of hours resulted in a pledge to take the sacred ground training that I know a number of you have taken. But I think it's key that the vestry decided as a body to do that as a body. My understanding is, I guess that's the first time, we did that. And that work really resulted in our racial justice and equity draft statement. If you haven't taken Sacred Ground, you need to. It's transformational in terms of the information that it provides, and really provides the overview, the good, the bad, the ugly of our historic past. And it really opened, I think, a lot of our eyes in terms of the injustices, especially with Black, Latino, Asian American folks across the country. It really, it's a 11-part video and in-person driven conversation. And it really, I think, is important that everyone really look at. So I'm hoping we can do that in the future. Next, please. So again, I think a lot of that work, as well as work with the steering committee here, our rector, associate rector, Ann Dursey, of course, put together this draft racial justice and equity statement. You've seen it. It was a special presentation to everyone that Sarah sent in April. And it's organized, I think, really smartly about, and those three pillars are belief, acknowledgement, and action. And we're in the midst of working on a confidential survey. It's going to go back out to everyone to try to gauge the reaction to that, and hopefully use that in order to basically put together and adopt the final statement. Next. And that's, the statement itself. I think you have that, and I would ask you to take a look at that again and at your leisure. Next. So the newer piece that's hot off the press, just really started in the last couple of months, is that there is a new St. John's RJE task force. And that was put together by the Justice and Outreach Coordinating Committee, and April Barker, who's here, and I are the co-chairs of that group. And literally it's just starting. So we need your help, and we'll be getting to that in just a minute. But I think the mission statement is worth reading. The RJE task force seeks to build a shared vision of the beloved community within the parish and to support initiatives undertaken by church ministries, staff, and members. We seek to foster a welcoming and inclusive congregation through sustained efforts to undo structures and practices of racism and white privilege, first within the congregation, but also in the broader community. To that end, the committee will plan and coordinate dialogue and engaging activities that promote education of the congregation. Consider this one of the first. Self-reflection and assessment in all aspects of congregational life. Our efforts will seek to create a non-polarizing, honest, inclusive, and safe environment for all people to learn and grow. By reflecting what the beloved community looks like, we will become an institution that's intentionally diverse, and we have a transformative influence in the community. We are in the midst of really getting off the ground. We certainly encourage you as part of this to seriously consider the sacred ground training. It's really foundational. And any of us can provide you with more information on that, of course. Next, please. So if you want to participate, it's easy. Please contact any of us. There's our contact information. We will make, in addition to this recording, available the slide deck so that you can actually go back and find all of these links again at your leisure. Next, please. And I hope this looks familiar to one person here in the room. If you want more information, there are splendid foundational documents that I think show the rich history of getting to this point in time. The Realizing Beloved Community book, which Anne actually shared with us, thank you, talks about what has happened with the Bishop's Theology Committee for the last 5 years or so. And it's really useful because it shows examples of reparations that the church has done and offers some ideas for the future. There's also something that I came across online, which is from the 2022 report to the 80th General Convention. It's a presiding officer's working group on truth telling, and that's available online at this link. So with that, I thank you for your time, and we'll open the floor if anyone has questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark and Cathy. Wonderful. We're going to open it up now for questions, and I'll take questions both online and in person. So if you are in person, I just ask that you please walk up to that microphone that's in the center of the room. I'll see you standing there and I'll call on you. And that way, when you speak into that microphone, everyone at home can also hear what the question is. And if you are participating from home, I would ask that you please use the reactions button at the bottom of your screen to raise your electronic hand, and I will call on you, and then I'll ask you to unmute yourself, and then you can do that, and then you can phrase your question. And Cathy and Mark will take turns to try to answer that, and I'm sure maybe even some others in the room who might feel better qualified to answer certain questions about where St. John's is moving and all this kind of stuff can ask their questions as well. All right, so it looks like Catherine is standing at the microphone. Catherine, go ahead.
Yes, and this is a question I'm embarrassed to say it didn't occur to me to ask my husband, Mark. So you mentioned several times, or you encouraged us to consider the sacred ground training. Is there another sacred ground training scheduled? What would it take to make that happen?
Yes, thank you. And hi, everybody. It's really great to be back. We've done 4 sacred ground circles so far. There are about 8 to 10 to 12 people who meet for 10 weeks, or actually now it's 11 weeks because they've added an action component for about an hour and a half. That's what's involved with readings, videos, and books that you use to prepare for the discussion that takes place weekly. We are hoping to have another sacred ground circle sometime towards the beginning of next year. We have a fantastic facilitator who has agreed to continue to work with St. John's because she's so inspired by the commitment that we've made to this subject. So if anyone is interested in that circle, please contact me, because I want to try to talk to you about the time and the place that would be most convenient for the next circle to take place. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. We have a question from home. This is a relatively new parishioner, Sawan Bestman. And Sawan, I just, go ahead and ask your question.
Good morning. Sorry. Thank you. I'm a lifelong Episcopalian. I grew up in Germantown. I'm new to Bethesda, and as Sari said, I'm new to the church. My question is there any consideration to delineation, specifically African-American versus Black American versus foundational Black American? I follow the reparations movement pretty closely, and I know that one of the caveats is delineation. So I was just curious how the diocese is if at all, tackling that issue?
Thank you, Swan. Who'd like to answer that question in the parish hall?
I will, Sari. It's Cathy.
Okay, Cathy, go ahead.
The question, it's a great question, but the fact is that injustice has been done to all people of color. The initial findings were pointed at the slavery issue, and that was as we looked at that, you realize that it went on after slavery. It went on in the form of Jim Crow laws. It went on in the forms of organized white supremacy movements. And it went on with redlining. And it went on after World War II, after the armed forces were integrated, and that Blacks were not able to obtain their benefits from the GI Bill that white people were able to get. It went on through covenants that were marked unconstitutional by the Supreme Court at some point, but there's still this hatred of some people, the white supremacists in America, that's forced at anyone of color. So no, we're not delineating one group from another. We're all together in this. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Other questions or comments? Nancy Adams, let me invite you to unmute yourself.
I just wanted to add to that answer, because I think one of the things I really appreciated of the Sacred Ground sessions, was they really kind of go through the history of different ethnic groups that have faced discrimination. Starting early on, certainly with the Native Americans, but then looking at how Asians and Latinos who had been here for a very long time were also discriminated against. And I think looking at this from a very broad perspective, including in particular, of course, our slavery history, and that I think is really important for us too. We have a very ethnically diverse community around us, and I think we need to be thinking of this as in a broad sense. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you, Nancy. Parish Hall, looks like we have Bill.
Yes, thanks, Sarah. So thinking about the question of reparations, I've often found it very daunting because the magnitude of the harm is so overwhelming. Just imagining something that can actually address that is difficult, right? And so I wonder, Mark, you alluded to what the diocese or the church is doing for reparations. I wonder if you can elaborate that, and then how you approach that question of what steps can be taken. I'm presuming small steps, but how the church is sort of approaching that question.
Sure. Well, first of all, we have to be sure that the resolution is going to be passed in January. And we certainly are all, we're thinking that will happen, I hope resoundingly, by the delegates that are there. The diocese will then create a special panel to basically look right at that point in detail. And they'll have, as I understand it, about a year to do their work. And then in 2024, they'll bring that back for additional discussion and action, I guess, by the next convention. In looking at reparations, this obviously is it's a complex issue, and I don't think anyone necessarily has all the answers to that. However, there's been good thinking, certainly in the church, and actually by government units around the country, to look at this from the perspective really of systemic damage. So big ticket items like negative effects of redlining to health, to home ownership, a variety of things that have impacted various groups. So I think that what will happen is that those kind of classifications of damage will inform what steps can be taken. And I imagine that will probably happen here at St. John's too. I can tell you that, this is completely up in the air. It hasn't been focused on as a group, but I think we'll be looking at that. And certainly I hope our little task force will be front and center in trying to answer that, question. Ultimately, I think the decision on what form they take at the parish level is the vestry and, leadership. But I think that's a good way to think about it, that especially it's just not about money. It's not about giving a check to someone. It's about making a structural change in the way we do business and the relationship we have between. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. I can't see who that is standing at the microphone. And please introduce yourself. And
Good morning, it's Cindy Anderson.
hi, Cindy.
I understand the Diocese of Maryland has made this. And one of the slides, I think, showed that we'll be learning from all the other Episcopal churches, but I'm sure what Eugene Sutton and that diocese have been doing over the past couple of years can help inform us. And I wonder to what extent you're looking at that or how that will go forward.
Oh, yes. Bishop Sutton and the work of the Maryland Diocese is certainly one of, I think, the flagships in terms of what, has happened around the country, diocese. I believe, and the way their effort was structured is that they put together a working group on this issue and brought in especially people from communities around Maryland, predominantly Baltimore, to define what they thought would be appropriate, reparations. One of the keys that came out of that was actually focused on education, and it basically provides funding to move African-American children into a variety of higher performing schools to basically give them the educational foundation to then jump into college and university. That, I think there was something like $1 million, if I'm remembering correctly. That was, some of those were diocesan funds, parish funds, but also pulled in funding from organizations, private companies to help do this. So certainly the Maryland example is one of the things. And if you're interested in particular about this, one of the handouts that you can get to on one of these links is actually a special study that was done for EDO, the Diocese of Washington, that looked across the country at church-based initiatives. It's really fascinating. I encourage you to take a look at that because it provides, again, a current assessment of this across the country.
It was actually more than just churches.
Right.
It was governments
Right.
and small organizations, small colleges, large colleges, Virginia Theological Seminary being one of them, and Swanee being very well known for their views. They've all looked at the issue of reparations and have come to terms with it.
Great. Yeah, some of us have actually pulled that information independently. I've got a bunch of examples from local governments. Certainly we can make that available to you too.
All right. Thank you, Earl.
Hi, Earl O'Donnell, or as I'm more commonly referred to at St. John's these days, Mr. Cathy O'Donnell. Um, I've had the opportunity to read through, because Cathy's allowed me, some of the reports that have come from the parishes that she's working with about their own history. And I just wanted to invite her to provide, can't give the full reports, obviously, but provide some of the findings about their history that might be informative to us.
Great.
Okay. Well, there are, as I said, about 22 parishes that are working with our History Partners group. And the reports range from the first 20 years that the congregation was formed through the present day. And the most striking ones are, the most striking one to me is one that I'm not going to name the church because the report's not final yet, but they had a Black church associated with their church for a time, and they effectively allowed realtors to take over the church, to shut down the church. And then instead of giving the money to that congregation to reform somewhere, they kept the money themselves. And that is just purely wrong in every sense of the word. And they are, the person who's written it is very upset at what she's found. Other churches have found that their churches were built by enslaved people, that the funds that were used to build their churches were funds that were obtained through chattel slavery. And there's just lots of that type of history out there. There's also history from later churches like ours who were formed after the Civil War, where the issue of covenants in the neighborhood of black lining, red lining, I don't know why I keep saying black lining, red lining through the area has really harmed the population, and it's harmed all of us. So that's briefly with this.
Thank you, Cathy. Anne.
Yes, since Cathy was speaking about history, there's one point that she shared with me that I think might be of interest to the group about the history of our name here at St. John's Norwood. Would you be willing to share that, Cathy?
Sure. So our church was founded in 1873 by a group of people who would get together in their own homes, and Reverend Avery would ride on horseback from Silver Spring to conduct services in their homes, starting in the fall of 1873. He donated, Colonel Dodge and his wife donated land that a church would be built on because they realized they had enough congregants to start their own church. And as a mission of Grace Church, or Lambeth Parish, as it was known in Silver Spring, we were established and built the church in 1874. At that time, Colonel Dodge, who had been a member of St. John's Georgetown, asked that the church be named St. John's because of his affiliation there, and that the name Norwood be attached. The name Norwood comes from his family home, his property. It was called Norwood. He had, prior to the Civil War and during the Civil War, had enslaved people working for him or working at his behest. He went to the Congress after the Civil War and asked for reparations because the slaves had been freed. The enslaved people had been freed. And so the name Norwood is very tainted, but it's still the name we've been known by for almost 150 years. And I haven't read the deed yet to see if it's possible to change the name, which I know a couple people would like to do, but I just don't know if that's doable.
Well,
Until
obviously, that would be the product of a much longer conversation and the congregation going through its own process and conversations around it. So I don't want anybody to freak out about big
Right,
changes
right.
happening overnight. So
Not to mention it would need to be approved by the diocese.
yeah, but this is good for us to, what we're doing is just we're uncovering things, right? We can talk about the therefore as that comes up, but right now just knowing what the truth is and what we're learning, that it's good to sit with that. So thank you for this revelatory forum. Okay, I can't identify who is standing at the microphone. I think that's Jim. Go ahead.
You're right, sir. It's Jim Winkler. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for your commitment to this really complicated topic and for the briefing this morning. Just two comments on history. One, Heather Cox Richardson wrote a terrific book, How the South Won the Civil War. Many of you have probably read it. To me, it was quite an eye-opener. Just the title jumps out at you that that Civil War was not what we conventionally think of as how history unfolded. And it's very enlightening, you know, how a lot of the previous sort of social constructs have just continued, you know, in a very subtle but powerful way. So that title jumped out at me. Also, last weekend we had family visiting from Omaha and San Diego, and they wanted to go down to Monticello. We went down to Monticello and visited, hadn't been there in seemed like 100 years. And one of our family around the area said, well, are they talking about this slavery now? I said, what do you mean? They said, well, it wasn't that long ago where it was not part of the exhibition and the presentation. And in fact, they have updated it and have a number of videos and some explicit presentations about Thomas Jefferson's relationship to Sarah Hemming and, you know, the children and the slavery world that they lived in. So I think the real comment here is we're all coming around to begin to understand, not all, but part of society, you know, what that history is. The term that jumps out to me comes probably from Al Gore's reference to climate change, which is the inconvenient truth.
Yes.
And so I guess my question is this: as we live in a very privileged community, and do we look at the structural forces that we benefit from, you know, that may not necessarily be shared across our community? And one example is property taxes. We live in a virtuous circle of benefit because we have a wealthy community, affluent. We generate lots of taxes and it goes to our schools and our roads and everything that we benefit from. But that's not the case across our city and our community. And I just wonder and I haven't, you know, gotten up to speed on all of the work that's been done on reparations and justification and rationale for it. But I'm just curious how much we're looking in the mirror at the inconvenient truth in our daily lives, you know, in the community that we live in. And isn't it wonderful that our children have this benefit? But I think part of the reality and the inconvenient truth is we can't really have a just, stable, healthy society if our neighbors don't have some of those benefits in education, in job opportunities, in training, and so forth. So I'm just curious how much of that perspective is brought into the inconvenient truth that you're working on. Thank you.
Wow, that's a great question.
Thank you, Jim.
It is an inconvenient truth. And it is reality that some of us are so much better off than our neighbors. But in order to change that, we have to all be willing to give up a little something, to give up a little of our pride, maybe, of our sanctimonious attitude, to give up to recognize that we are all individually the same, that God loves us, Jesus loves us, and would want us to make the changes that are necessary, starting at the individual level and building to the systemic level, where the churches, the schools, the workplace are all open to all and equally, not based on any type of privilege whatsoever. Does that answer you?
I think also, Jim, go ahead, Lisa. I think Jim's comment just stands on its own as something for us to pay attention to and listen to and be mindful of. So it's great. Lisa.
No, thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. Lisa Reisner, for those.
Lisa, a little closer to the microphone, if you don't mind. Yeah.
Is that better?
Perfect.
Awesome. Lisa Reisner for everybody here at home. Yes, thank you for the comment, and Cathy for what you shared about what the diocese is doing. I think it's also important to consider that Montgomery County is one of the most diverse counties in the entire country, and it is actually working fairly hard at trying to address some of those things within the county. I mean, there's been great disparities, you know, in certain parts of the county, and the county council has made a conscious effort, set up a task force, and is trying to address this sort of systematically through all of its policies and how it disperses money. So, you know, it's at the beginning, I think, of that, but it's an important component, and St. John's has been actively engaging with the county council and with the county executive on some of those issues. And Ann Dursey is in the interfaith faith community advisory board for the county, also focusing on these issues. So there are ways to move this forward, and we're working at a diocesan level. I think the church is working at a national level, and even St. John's is working at a local level on all of these issues. So it won't end soon, though. So new blood would be great. Join us.
Yeah. And until we can change people's hearts, and that's the hardest part. We can say all these things and make changes, but someone expressed to me, okay, if we pay reparations, whether it's through systemic means or individual means, what's to prevent people from saying, okay, we're done, I don't want to hear about it anymore? And I think about people who have been abused and they move on. They have forgiven the person who abused them, but they've not forgotten what happened to them. And it means they're never going to stop talking about it because it was an actual part of their history. And racism is an actual part of the history of this church, this diocese, and this country. And until we can get into people's hearts and change that, we're stuck. But I have hope and pray that we will, over time, change. I see it in the younger people. There's much more acceptance of women in the workplace, of Blacks in the workplace, of people wanting to recognize the equality of all of us. And I pray that continues.
All right, wonderful. We have time for maybe one, maybe two more questions, depending on how long they are, or comments. Anything, any other things that you want to know about the reparations task force that the diocese is engaging in? Even if you feel like you missed something, and you know, just a basic piece of information or anything like that, that would help you feel connected. Right.
Hi, sorry.
Hi, Sawan. Yeah.
Hi, I wanted to know the PowerPoint, is it on the church website?
Great question. Mark can answer this. Mark, go ahead.
Mark.
I guess Lisa, sorry, my bad.
Sorry, Mark had to go get ready for choir practice. So we're going to put up a shared drive which will have the slides and also a lot of the information that Cathy and Mark, the resources that they reference, stuff from the diocese, the Episcopal Church, and then we'll send out a link to the shared drive so anyone can access all of that.
And Lisa, where will we send that link? Like, so where would Sawan be looking out for that link? Is that
We can
a
send it
Crossroads
to her.
thing?
We can send it out on Crossroads.
Okay, perfect. In the newsletter. Maybe we can get it in for next week's newsletter. Could that?
Yep, sure.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank
Sawan,
you.
does that help?
Yes, thank you.
All right, friends, thank you so much for being here today. A big thank you to Mark and to Cathy for putting this together and for all the work of justice that we're striving toward. And I hope that you'll all stick around and enjoy some donuts in the parish hall. And those of you who are at home and want to make your way to church for in-person worship, now's the time to get in your car. And for the rest, we'll see you online in just a little bit. God bless everyone. See you next week.